The skies over Korea were about to become the most dangerous place on Earth. Soviet pilots, trained by veterans of World War II, flying some of the most advanced jets their country had ever built, were suddenly finding themselves outmatched, outmaneuvered, and outgunned by an American aircraft that seemed to defy every advantage they thought they had. Men who had fought the Luftwaffe, who had survived Stalingrad, who had logged thousands of hours in the cockpit, were coming home shaken. Some didn't come home at all. And the reason wasn't just technology. It was something far more unsettling. And if you stay with me for the next few minutes, you're going to understand exactly why the F-86 Sabre became the single most feared aircraft the Soviet Union ever faced in aerial combat. If you find this kind of deep dive into Cold War history as gripping as I do, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because we go places the history books skip over. Every single week. Now, to understand the fear, you have to understand the confidence that came before it. By the time the Korean War broke out in 1950, Soviet aviation had every reason to be proud. The MiG-15 was a genuinely extraordinary machine. It climbed faster than almost anything the Americans had. It had a service ceiling that left many Western fighters gasping for altitude. Its cannon armament was devastating. 3 heavy-caliber guns that could tear apart a bomber with a single burst. Soviet engineers had built something that, on paper, should have ruled the sky. And for a brief moment at the start of the conflict, it looked like it would. American pilots flying straight-winged jets like the F-80 Shooting Star were suddenly facing an enemy they couldn't catch, couldn't outclimb, and in many cases, couldn't escape. The early weeks of MiG Alley, that narrow corridor of airspace above the Yalu River separating Korea from Manchuria, were brutal for United Nations air forces. Something had to change fast. What changed was the arrival of the F-86 Sabre. At first glance, the matchup looked close. The MiG-15 still had the edge in raw climb rate and ceiling. It could get higher faster and hit harder with those cannons. By pure performance numbers, many analysts thought the MiG should have dominated. But aerial combat is never decided purely by performance numbers, and that is precisely where the Soviet fear began to take root. The F-86 had something the MiG-15 did not: hydraulically assisted flight controls. This is a detail that sounds technical and dry until you understand what it meant at 500 miles per hour in a rolling scissors fight at 40,000 feet. The MiG's controls were manual. At high speeds, they became brutally heavy. Almost impossible to move with the force and precision a dogfight demands. A Soviet pilot pulling into a hard turn at maximum speed was fighting his own aircraft as much as he was fighting the enemy. The physical effort required was enormous, and it slowed reaction time in the moments that mattered most. American pilots in the Sabre felt almost none of that resistance. The controls responded with a lightness and precision that let them throw the aircraft exactly where they wanted it. Exactly when they wanted it there. In the turning, diving, climbing chaos of a close-range dogfight, that responsiveness was worth more than any extra knot of speed or extra 1,000 feet of ceiling. But there was something else. Something that went beyond the aircraft itself and cut straight to the human factor. American pilots flying the Sabre were, in many cases, veterans of World War II aerial combat. Men like Francis Gabreski, who had shot down 28 enemy aircraft over Europe. Men like Vermont Garrison and Glenn Eagleston. These were not young pilots learning their trade over hostile territory. They were hunters, and Korea was not their first war. Their aggression, their tactical instincts, their ability to read a developing fight 3 moves ahead, all of it had been forged in the deadliest air war in history. Soviet pilots in Korea were officially not there at all. The Kremlin denied their presence entirely. That political fiction created a dangerous operational reality. Soviet pilots flew in Chinese and North Korean markings. They operated under strict rules that limited how far south they could engage, preventing them from being captured over territory where their identity might be confirmed. They were told not to fly over the front lines, not to venture near the coast where they might be forced down and identified. And these restrictions stripped them of tactical freedom at the worst possible moment, when flexibility and aggression are the difference between a kill and being killed. And then there was the kill ratio. When the war ended and analysts began piecing together what had actually happened in Mig Alley, the numbers were stark. American sources claimed a kill ratio somewhere in the range of 10 to 1 in favor of the Sabre. Soviet and Russian sources disputed that figure vigorously in the decades that followed, and more recent scholarship has pulled the ratio closer, perhaps somewhere between 2 to 1 and 4 to 1 depending on the methodology. But even the most conservative estimates confirmed what the pilots already knew in their bones. The Sabre was winning. Not always. Not easily. But consistently. And in a way that no amount of MiG performance data could fully explain. Part of the explanation was the gun sight. The F-86 was equipped with an early radar-ranging gun sight that automatically calculated the correct lead angle when firing at a maneuvering target. Soviet pilots were still using optical gun sights that required a skilled pilot to manually judge the deflection shot. In the fractions of a second available during a high-speed crossing engagement, that difference in targeting technology translated directly into hits versus misses, kills versus escapes. The fear that Soviet pilots developed for the Sabre was not irrational. It was the product of hard experience, of watching wingmen go down, of returning to base with damage they couldn't explain, of engaging an enemy that seemed to anticipate their moves and punish every mistake without hesitation. Some of the most accomplished Soviet aces of the era, men like Yevgeny Pepelyaev, now who was among the highest-scoring pilots of the conflict, acknowledged the Sabre as a worthy and dangerous adversary. That acknowledgement, coming from men who had nothing to gain from inflating the enemy's reputation, speaks to something real. What the Korean Air War ultimately revealed was a truth that Cold War planners on both sides had to absorb carefully. Technology matters, but it rarely decides conflicts alone. Training matters. Doctrine matters. The intangible qualities of pilot confidence, tactical freedom, and institutional experience matter enormously. The MiG-15 was a great aircraft. In some respects, it was a better aircraft. But the F-86 Sabre, in the hands of experienced American pilots operating with greater tactical freedom and equipped with superior cockpit technology, turned those Soviet advantages into irrelevant statistics. When the men who flew through Mig Alley and came out the other side carried the memory of those fights for the rest of their lives. And somewhere in the Soviet aviation records that spent decades locked behind Cold War secrecy, the same story was being quietly told, that above the Yalu River in the freezing Korean sky, American pilots had handed the Soviet Air Force a lesson it would spend the next decade trying to answer.